Blood-red clouds painted the horizon as Eleanor Owens rode into Whispering Creek, her exhausted horse kicking up dust on the main street. The year was 1878, and word of her arrival had preceded her like a storm front. Townsfolk peered through windows and from behind saloon doors, their suspicious gazes following her every move. Eleanor kept her chin high despite the weight of their judgment. "There she goes," a woman whispered loudly enough for Eleanor to hear. The widow who buried 3 husbands before she turned 25. Eleanor pretended not to hear, though the words stung like a whip. At 26, she had indeed buried 3 men who'd had the misfortune of marrying her, though none had died by her hand. Illness, a mining accident, and an outlaw's bullet had made her a widow 3 times over. The losses had carved hollows in her heart and rumors in her wake. She guided her dappled mare toward the only livery stable in town, where a weathered sign swung in the late afternoon breeze. The stable hand, a boy no more than 15, took one look at her and backed away. "My pa says we ain't got room," he stammered, though the stable behind him stood half empty. Eleanor sighed, too tired to argue. "I can pay double." The boy shook his head, his eyes wide with superstition and fear. "I'll take care of her horse," came a deep voice from behind. Eleanor turned to see a tall man dismounting from a sturdy black stallion. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his Stetson, but she could make out a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes the color of a summer storm. He wore trail-worn clothes, a faded blue shirt, leather vest, and denim pants tucked into scuffed boots. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster well-worn but the revolver well-maintained. "Thomas Irving," he introduced himself with a slight tip of his hat. "Just passing through." The stable boy looked between them, uncertain. "Mr. Irving, sir, you don't understand. That's Eleanor Owens. They call her the Widowmaker. Bad luck follows her like buzzards." Thomas's gaze never left Eleanor's face. With deliberate movements, he led his stallion to the hitching post beside her mare and tied the reins securely. "Then we'll be lucky together," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent street where several onlookers had gathered. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, equal parts embarrassment and something else she couldn't name. "You don't need to do this, Mr. Irving. I can manage." "I've no doubt of that, Mrs. Owens, but a man can make his own decisions about luck." He turned to the stable boy and placed several coins in his reluctant hand. 2 stalls, fresh hay, and water for both horses. The boy looked down at the money, then back at Thomas. "Your funeral," he muttered, but took the reins of both horses and led them inside. Thomas offered Eleanor a slight smile. "Need help with your belongings?" Eleanor studied him, trying to discern his motives. Men didn't offer help without wanting something in return. That was a lesson she'd learned the hard way. "Why would you risk association with a woman like me?" "A woman like you?" His eyebrow arched. "You mean a woman traveling alone with the courage to face a town full of superstitious fools? I admire that." Eleanor couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her lips. "You must be new to these parts. No one admires me, Mr. Irving." "They fear me, or worse, they pity me, Thomas," he corrected, "and I've never been one to follow the crowd." For the first time in months, Eleanor felt a spark of something that might have been hope. She knew better than to trust it, but she couldn't deny the warmth spreading through her chest. "Very well, Thomas. I could use help with these bags. I'm hoping to rent a room at the hotel if they'll have me." "They'll have you," he said with a certainty that suggested he'd make sure of it. Together they walked down the main street, ignoring the whispers that followed them like autumn leaves in a breeze. Eleanor was accustomed to the sideways glances and hushed conversations. Thomas, however, met each stare with a level gaze that sent most eyes skittering away. The Whispering Creek Hotel was a 2-story building with peeling white paint and a wide porch. As they approached, the proprietor, a portly man with mutton chop sideburns, stepped outside and crossed his arms. "We're full up," he announced before they'd even reached the steps. Thomas stopped, shifting Eleanor's carpet bag to his other hand. "Mr. Hollies, Gerald Hollies. Mr. Hollies, I can see your vacancy sign from here." Thomas pointed to the window where a small sign hung. Hollies' face reddened. "That's an old sign. Forgot to take it down." "I think you're mistaken," Thomas said, his voice pleasant but with an edge of steel. "I rented a room yesterday. I distinctly recall you mentioning you had several available. Eleanor watched the exchange with interest. Thomas was lying, of course. He'd just ridden into town, same as her. But his confidence was unwavering. Holly's gaze darted between them. You're not. Together, we're two paying customers who require separate rooms, Thomas clarified. Unless that's a problem, the implied threat hung in the air. Holly swallowed hard. No problem. But I warn you, Mr. Irving, getting mixed up with her kind. Thomas took a step forward. You mean a lady of refinement who's traveled a long distance and deserves basic courtesy. That kind. Holly's retreated a step. 2 rooms, but don't say I didn't warn you. Inside, the hotel lobby was modestly furnished with a worn settee and several chairs surrounding a stone fireplace. A few guests lingered, eyeing Eleanor with undisguised curiosity as Holly's begrudgingly assigned them rooms. Second floor end of the hall, Holly said, sliding a key across the counter to Eleanor. And yours is across from hers, he told Thomas, providing another key. Thomas thanked him with exaggerated politeness, then escorted Eleanor up the creaking staircase. You didn't have to do that, Eleanor said when they reached her door, but I appreciate it. Thomas set her bag down. I meant what I said about making my own decisions. Besides, I've never put much stock in superstitions, even when they follow a woman who's buried 3 husbands. His expression softened. Especially then, tragedy isn't contagious, Mrs. Owens. Eleanor, she corrected, mirroring his earlier response. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Eleanor, perhaps you'd join me for supper. The dining room downstairs looked decent enough. She hesitated. Dining with a stranger wasn't something she did lightly, especially not a man as handsome as Thomas Irving. But there was something about him that felt different from the opportunists and fortune hunters she'd encountered before. I'd like that, she finally said. Give me an hour to freshen up. I'll be waiting at the bottom of the stairs. True to his word, Thomas was waiting when Eleanor descended the staircase, having changed into a clean blouse and skirt and pinned her dark hair into a neat arrangement. She'd applied a touch of rose water, a small indulgence she rarely allowed herself anymore. Thomas stood as she approached, and she noticed he'd also changed into a clean shirt and brushed the trail dust from his clothes. His hair, the color of burnished copper, was still damp from washing. You look lovely, he said simply. The dining room was half full, and their entrance caused a momentary lull in conversation before the buzz resumed, now punctuated with whispers and glances in their direction. Thomas guided Eleanor to a table in the corner, positioning himself so that his back was to the wall, and he faced the room the instinct of a man accustomed to watching his surroundings. A server approached their table with visible reluctance. What can I get you? She asked, addressing only Thomas. The special for both of us, he replied, and a bottle of your best wine. The girl nodded and hurried away without making eye contact with Eleanor. I'm sorry about that, Thomas said. Eleanor shook her head. I'm used to it, though I admit it's nice having company for a change. Usually I dine alone in my room. Their loss, Thomas said, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. So, what brings you to Whispering Creek? Eleanor considered how much to share. I'm passing through on my way to Denver. My sister lives there with her husband and children, I thought. Perhaps a fresh start, running from the whispers, more like seeking somewhere they haven't reached yet, though I'm beginning to think such a place doesn't exist. She smoothed her napkin across her lap. And you said you're just passing through as well. Thomas nodded. I was a Texas Ranger for 7 years. Now I do private work, tracking mostly. You're a bounty hunter? Eleanor asked, suddenly wary. Not exactly. I find people who don't want to be found, but not always for the law. Sometimes it's families looking for lost loved ones. Sometimes it's banks trying to recover assets, he shrugged. It pays well and keeps me moving. Is that why you're here? Tracking someone. Before he could answer, their food arrived, plates of beef stew with potatoes and carrots, accompanied by thick slices of bread. The wine followed, a decent Bordeaux that suggested the hotel's cellar was better stocked than its rooms. Thomas poured for both of them before continuing. I was following a lead on a man who embezzled from a bank in San Antonio. Trail went cold about 50 miles back. He took a sip of wine. Now I'm just deciding which direction to try next. Eleanor studied him over the rim of her glass. There was something he wasn't saying, but she had secrets of her own, so she didn't press. "How did you lose 3 husbands?" Thomas asked, changing the subject. "If you don't mind my asking." Eleanor set down her glass. Few people asked directly, they preferred to speculate behind her back. "My first husband, James, caught influenza 6 months after our wedding. He was gone within a week." The memory still brought a pang of grief. "The second, Michael, died in a mine collapse near Virginia City. We were married just over a year." Thomas nodded, his expression sympathetic without being pitying. "And the third, Charles." Eleanor's voice hardened slightly. "He was shot in the back during a card game in Abilene. We'd been married 8 months." She didn't add that Charles had been a gambler and a drunk who'd married her for the insurance money from her second husband, or that she'd been planning to leave him before his death. "That's a lot of heartache for someone so young," Thomas observed. "The first was love. The others were mistakes born of loneliness." Eleanor surprised herself with her candor. "After the third, people started talking, said I was cursed or worse, that I had something to do with their deaths. The rumors followed me from town to town. It became easier to keep moving than to try to build a life somewhere." Thomas reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "People fear what they don't understand. Death makes them uncomfortable, so they look for someone to blame. And I make a convenient target." Eleanor smiled without humor. "A woman alone is already suspicious. A woman who's outlived multiple husbands must be a witch or a murderer. Or simply unlucky," Thomas suggested. "Very unlucky," Eleanor agreed, "which is why you should reconsider being seen with me." Thomas leaned back in his chair, a challenge in his eyes. "I've faced outlaws and angry Comanche. I think I can handle a little bad luck." Despite herself, Eleanor laughed. It felt foreign, that sound coming from her throat. How long had it been since she genuinely laughed? "You're either very brave or very foolish, Thomas Irving." "I've been called both," he admitted with a grin. "Often on the same day." They finished their meal with lighter conversation. Thomas told her about growing up on a small ranch in the Texas Hill Country, about his years as a ranger during the state's reconstruction after the war, about the places he'd seen in his travels. Eleanor shared stories of her childhood in St. Louis, her journey west with her first husband seeking opportunity, and her plans to help her sister with her growing family in Denver. By the time they finished the wine, the dining room had emptied, and even the server had stopped giving Eleanor anxious glances. "Thank you for the meal," Eleanor said as they climbed the stairs to their rooms, "and for the company." Thomas stopped at her door. "The pleasure was mine, Eleanor. Perhaps breakfast tomorrow before you continue your journey." Eleanor hesitated. She'd planned to leave at first light, to minimize her interaction with the townsfolk, but the thought of another meal with Thomas was tempting. "I'd like that. Until morning, then." He took her hand and raised it to his lips, brushing a kiss across her knuckles. The gesture was old-fashioned and courtly, at odds with his rugged appearance, but it sent a flutter through Eleanor's chest. She watched him cross the hall to his own room before she slipped inside hers and closed the door. Leaning against it, she pressed her hand to her cheek and felt the warmth there. It was foolish to feel this way about a man she'd just met, especially given her history. Yet there was something about Thomas that made her want to trust him, despite all her hard-earned caution. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit street below. Whispering Creek was quiet now, most of its buildings dark except for the saloon down the way, where light and piano music spilled onto the boardwalk. She should be packing for an early departure, not daydreaming about a handsome stranger who'd shown her a kindness. A movement in the street caught her eye. A man on horseback rode slowly past the hotel, looking up at the windows. Even in the dim light, Eleanor recognized the pockmarked face and distinctive silhouette of Jasper Mills, a man who'd been in Abilene when her third husband died. A man who'd made certain untoward suggestions after Charles's funeral, which she'd firmly rejected. Eleanor stepped back from the window, her heart suddenly racing. What was Mills doing here? Had he followed her? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She'd left Abilene because of men like him, vultures who thought a widow, especially one with her reputation, was easy prey. She turned away from the window, her momentary peace shattered. Perhaps she should leave tonight after all, slip away while the town slept. But that would mean leaving without saying goodbye to Thomas, and the thought disappointed her more than it should. Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, weighing her options. If Mills was here, he likely wasn't alone. He ran with a rough crowd, men who drifted between legitimate work and outlawry as opportunities arose. Men who wouldn't hesitate to harm a woman if they thought they could get away with it. A soft knock at her door startled her. Eleanor froze, listening. "Eleanor," Thomas's voice was low. "Are you awake?" She moved to the door but didn't open it. "Yes, what is it?" "I saw someone watching the hotel, a man on a sorrel horse with a white blaze. Do you know him?" Eleanor's breath caught. Thomas had seen Mills too. "Why do you ask?" "Because he looked up at your window specifically, and I don't like the way he was watching." There was a pause. "May I come in? I'd rather not have this conversation through the door." Eleanor hesitated, then unlocked the door and opened it just enough to see Thomas standing there, his expression serious. She stepped back to let him enter, then quickly closed and locked the door behind him. "His name is Jasper Mills," she said without preamble. "He knew my third husband in Abilene." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "And what's his interest in you?" Eleanor crossed her arms, suddenly aware she was alone in her hotel room with a man she barely knew. "He made certain propositions after Charles died, suggested I needed a man to take care of me." Her lip curled at the memory. "When I refused, he became unpleasant. It's part of why I left Abilene, and now he's here." Thomas moved to the window, carefully peering out without being seen. "Do you think he followed you?" "It's possible, or it could be coincidence." Even as she said it, Eleanor didn't believe it. Whispering Creek was too small, too out of the way for Mills to be here by chance. Thomas turned from the window. "I don't believe in that many coincidences. If he followed you from Abilene, he wants something." "What should I do?" Eleanor asked, hating the vulnerability in her voice but unable to suppress it. Thomas considered for a moment. "We could leave tonight, but traveling in the dark has its own risks, and if he's watching the hotel, he'd see us go." He glanced at the bed, still made and unslept in. "Is your door secure?" Eleanor nodded. "The lock seems solid enough. Good, get some rest. I'll keep watch from my room. I have a view of the street. In the morning, we'll figure out what Mills is after and deal with it." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "This isn't your problem, Thomas. I don't expect you to involve yourself in my troubles." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap on his skin. "I already have," he said quietly. "The moment I tied my horse next to yours." Their eyes met, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, a current of understanding that went beyond words. This man, a stranger just hours ago, was offering to stand with her against whatever threat Mills represented. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that for someone you just met?" Thomas's gaze never wavered. "Because I recognize something in you, Eleanor Owens, a strength that doesn't deserve to be hounded from town to town by superstition and men like Mills." His hand reached up, hesitating a moment before brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And because I make my own choices about who deserves my help." The touch sent a warmth through Eleanor that had nothing to do with fear or anxiety. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her, and she wasn't sure if she wanted him to or not. But Thomas stepped back, restoring the proper distance between them. "Lock the door behind me," he instructed. "I'll knock 3 times if there's trouble, otherwise I'll see you at breakfast." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. She followed him to the door and secured it after he left, listening to his footsteps cross the hall to his own room. Then she leaned against the door, eyes closed, trying to make sense of the tumult of emotions this day had brought. She'd ridden into Whispering Creek expecting the usual cold shoulders and whispered insults. Instead, she'd found Thomas Irving, a man who looked past her reputation to see her. And now Jasper Mills, a specter from her past, had appeared to threaten her newfound sense of peace. Eleanor moved away from the door and began to prepare for bed, though she doubted sleep would come easily. Through the wall, she could hear Thomas moving in his room, the floorboards creaking as he presumably positioned himself near the window to keep watch. The thought of him standing guard gave her a measure of comfort she hadn't felt in a long time. As she slipped beneath the covers, Eleanor found herself hoping that breakfast would come quickly. The first light of dawn was just touching the horizon when Eleanor woke. She'd slept fitfully. dreams of Charles's death and Jasper Mills's leering face intermingling with images of Thomas standing between her and danger. She rose quickly, splashing water on her face from the basin, and dressing in a practical traveling outfit, a dark blue skirt and matching jacket over a white blouse with sturdy boots that had seen many miles. As she pinned her hair, Eleanor considered her next move. Her instinct was still to leave town as quickly as possible, to outrun Mills and the rumors that dogged her steps. But Thomas's presence complicated things. He'd offered help, and part of her, a part she'd thought long buried under grief and suspicion, wanted to accept it. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. "Eleanor, are you awake?" Thomas's voice was low. She opened the door to find him fully dressed and alert, despite what must have been a night of little sleep. "Good morning. Did you see anything?" Thomas shook his head. Mills rode past twice more during the night, but he didn't approach the hotel. "He's staying at the saloon down the street. I saw him go in around midnight, and he hadn't come out by the time dawn broke." Eleanor nodded, absorbing this information. "I should leave before he wakes up." "And go where?" "If he followed you this far, what's to stop him from following you to Denver?" Thomas leaned against the doorframe. "I think we need to understand what he wants." "I know what men like Mills want," Eleanor said bitterly. Thomas's expression softened. "Perhaps, but there might be more to it." "Your husband, how exactly did he die?" Eleanor frowned at the change in subject. "I told you, he was shot during a card game." "Were you there?" "No, I was at our lodgings. The sheriff came to tell me." The memory was still vivid: the knock on the door, the uncomfortable expression on the lawman's face, the mixture of grief and guilty relief she'd felt upon hearing the news. And Mills, was he at the game? Eleanor thought back. "I'm not sure." He was a friend of Charles. They rode together sometimes. After the funeral, Mills said Charles owed him money, but I had nothing to give him. A sudden realization struck her. "You think this is about money?" Thomas shrugged. "It's often about money or something Charles had that Mills wants." He straightened up. "Let's get breakfast and then see what we can learn about Mills's presence here." The dining room was nearly empty when they arrived, with only an elderly couple seated by the window. The same server from the previous night approached, her manner slightly less hostile than before. "Coffee," she offered, setting down 2 cups without waiting for an answer. "Thank you," Eleanor said. "And whatever you're serving for breakfast." The girl nodded and retreated to the kitchen. "I've been thinking," Thomas said once they were alone. "If Mills is after something he believes Charles had, we need to figure out what that might be." Eleanor sipped her coffee, grateful for its warmth and strength. Charles didn't have much when he died. Some clothes, his horse and saddle, a pocket watch that wasn't worth much. "The sheriff gave everything to me and I sold most of it before leaving Abilene." "Was there anything you kept? Anything personal?" Eleanor hesitated. "Just letters and such, a few photographs and his journal." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "Your husband kept a journal?" "Not regularly. He'd write in it when he was drinking, mostly complaints about his luck or plans for get-rich-quick schemes that never materialized." Eleanor shook her head at the memory. "I kept it more as a reminder of why I shouldn't rush into marriage again than for sentimental value." "Do you have it with you?" "In my bag." "Why? You think there's something in it Mills wants?" Thomas leaned forward. "If Charles and Mills were friends, maybe Charles wrote something Mills doesn't want known. Or maybe there's information about something valuable." Their breakfast arrived: plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits with gravy. Eleanor ate mechanically, her mind racing. She'd never read Charles's journal in detail, finding his drunken ramblings too painful and embarrassing. But perhaps she'd missed something important. "After we eat, I'd like to take a look at that journal," Thomas said. "And then perhaps we should have a conversation with Mr. Mills." Eleanor nearly choked on her coffee. Confront him. Is that wise? Sometimes the direct approach is best. Mills might back down if he realizes you're not alone. Thomas's eyes held a steely determination that suggested he was more than capable of handling men like Mills. "And if he doesn't back down?" Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then we'll know for certain he's a threat and act accordingly." They finished breakfast quickly and returned to Eleanor's room. She retrieved the journal from her carpet bag, a small, leather-bound book with worn edges and a faded cover. Charles had carried it in his breast pocket, often pulling it out in saloons to scribble drunken thoughts before tucking it away again. Thomas took it with careful hands, as if aware he was handling a piece of Eleanor's past, painful though it might be. He sat in the room's single chair while Eleanor perched on the edge of the bed, watching as he leafed through the pages of uneven handwriting. Most of this is what you described: complaints, plans for easy money, some unflattering comments about people he met. Thomas's brow furrowed as he continued reading. Wait, there's something here from about a month before his death. Eleanor leaned forward. What does it say? Mills and the boys have a plan for the bank in Salina. Easy money, he says. Just need to watch the guard rotations for a few more days. My cut should be enough to clear debts and head west with E. Thomas looked up. E would be you, Eleanor nodded, surprise evident on her face. Charles never mentioned any plan to rob a bank, and we weren't planning to head west at least. He never told me if we were. Thomas continued reading. Mills says the bank manager keeps the combination to the safe in his desk. Just need to get in after hours. He flipped to the next page. Watch the bank today. Guard changes at midnight. Back door has a simple lock. Mills' brother-in-law works as a janitor there, says he can get us the office key. Eleanor felt a chill. Charles was planning a robbery with Mills. It appears so. Thomas turned another page. Something's not right. Mills is bringing in more men than we need. Talking about splitting the take differently than we agreed. Don't trust him but need the money too badly to walk away. The next entry was dated just 3 days before Charles's death. Found out why Mills brought in extra men. They hit a stage near Junction City last month. 2 passengers dead. Mills says if I back out now, I'm a liability. Told he we're leaving tomorrow, heading to Colorado. Need to get away before this goes bad. Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing to the window. He never told me any of this. The day before he died, he said he was meeting friends for cards. He'd been drinking all day. She turned back to Thomas. The sheriff said he got into an argument over a hand of poker and someone shot him. Thomas closed the journal. Or Mills realized Charles was planning to run and eliminated a potential witness to the stage robbery. He stood, handing the journal back to Eleanor. I think we know what Mills wants now. He's making sure Charles didn't leave any evidence behind that could tie him to those murders. Eleanor clutched the journal. But why wait so long? Charles has been dead for almost a year. Maybe Mills just found out Charles kept a journal, or maybe he's been looking for you all this time. Thomas moved to stand beside her at the window. Either way, he's here now and he wants what you're holding. So I give it to him and he leaves me alone. Even as she said it, Eleanor knew it wouldn't be that simple. Thomas confirmed her fears. More likely he'll want to make sure you haven't told anyone else. Mills can't leave witnesses, Eleanor, not to murder. The reality of her situation settled over Eleanor like a heavy cloak. So what do we do? Before Thomas could answer, a commotion in the street below caught their attention. 3 riders had stopped in front of the hotel, and even from the second-floor window, Eleanor recognized Jasper Mills's lanky form and pockmarked face. The men with him were rough, looking, one heavyset with a bushy beard, the other thin and wiry with a scar across his cheek. Looks like Mills has decided to make his move, Thomas said grimly. Stay here and lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Eleanor grabbed his arm as he turned to leave. Where are you going? To have that conversation with Mills. Thomas's hand moved to the revolver at his hip, checking it with practiced ease. You can't face 3 armed men alone, Eleanor protested. Thomas's expression softened. I'm not planning to start a gunfight in the street, but Mills needs to understand that you're not unprotected. He gently removed her hand from his arm, squeezing it once before letting go. Lock the door, Eleanor. She watched him leave, then secured the door as instructed. Moving back to the window, she saw Thomas emerge from the hotel just as Mills and his companions dismounted. Even from a distance, she could see the surprise register on Mills's face at Thomas's appearance. The men spoke, too far away for Eleanor to hear their words, but their body language told the story. Mills gestured angrily, pointing at the hotel. Thomas stood his ground, one hand resting near his gun, his posture relaxed but alert. The 2 men with Mills spread out slightly, flanking him, a movement that made Eleanor's heart race with fear for Thomas. The conversation continued for several tense minutes. At one point, Mills took a step toward Thomas, who didn't back away. Whatever Thomas said in response made Mills stop short. The heavy-set man put a hand on Mills's shoulder, as if restraining him. More words were exchanged, and then, to Eleanor's surprise, Mills and his companions remounted their horses. Mills said something final to Thomas, his expression murderous, before the three men rode away down the street. Thomas watched them go, then turned and re-entered the hotel. Eleanor rushed to open the door when she heard his knock. What happened? What did Mills say? Thomas stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He demanded to see you, said you had something that belonged to him. His mouth quirked in a humorless smile. I suggested he might be mistaken. And he just left. I don't believe it. He left because I told him I knew about the stage robbery near Junction City, and that if anything happened to either of us, that information would find its way to the nearest U.S. Marshal. Thomas removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. It won't keep him away for long, but it gives us time to decide our next move. Eleanor sank onto the bed, clutching Charles's journal. This is why I keep moving. Trouble follows me wherever I go. This trouble isn't of your making, Eleanor. You didn't know what Charles was involved in. Thomas sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, but not so close as to be improper. Mills is the danger here, not you. Tell that to the townsfolk who crossed the street to avoid me yesterday, Eleanor said bitterly. They were right to think I bring misfortune. No, Thomas said firmly. They're wrong, and so are you if you believe that. Bad luck isn't contagious, and neither is other people's wrongdoing. He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. You're not responsible for Charles's choices or for Mills's crimes. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands. What do we do now? Mills knows I have the journal. He won't just go away. We could take the journal to the marshal in the next big town. Let the law deal with Mills, Thomas suggested. And then what? Continue to Denver as planned. Eleanor tried to imagine resuming her journey as if nothing had happened, but Thomas's presence had changed something fundamental in her calculations. If that's what you want. Thomas's voice was carefully neutral. Or there are other options. Eleanor raised her eyes to his. Such as. I was headed north after this job. Wyoming territory is opening up. New settlements, new opportunities. A place where no one knows either of us or our histories. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. You could come with me if you wanted. As a traveling companion, nothing more. Just until you decide where you want to settle. The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities. Eleanor studied Thomas's face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives, but found only sincerity and something else, a hopefulness he couldn't quite conceal. Why would you do that? She asked. Take on my troubles, offer me protection. You barely know me. Thomas's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. I know enough. I know you've faced loss and kept going. I know you've endured rumors and suspicion with dignity. I know you're intelligent and kind, despite having every reason not to be. His eyes, gray as storm clouds, held hers. And I know that when I saw you ride into town yesterday, something told me not to let you ride out alone. Eleanor's heart beat faster at his words. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her and seen more than a widow, a bad luck charm, or a potential conquest. Thomas saw her the real Eleanor, not the specter of misfortune that preceded her. I need to think, she said finally. This is all happening so quickly. Thomas nodded, releasing her hand. Of course, there's no rush to decide. He stood, retrieving his hat. But we should make plans to leave Whispering Creek, regardless of what you choose. Mills won't stay away for long. How soon can we go? I'll check on our horses, make sure they're rested enough for travel. We could leave by midday if necessary. Thomas moved to the door. Will you be all right here alone? I won't be gone long. Eleanor nodded, touched by his concern. I'll be fine. I'll pack my things and be ready when you return. After Thomas left, Eleanor sat for a long moment, Charles's journal still in her hands. The idea of traveling with Thomas was both exhilarating and terrifying. She barely knew him, yet she felt a connection to him that defied rational explanation. Was it merely gratitude for his protection, or something deeper? She placed the journal in her carpet bag and began methodically packing her few possessions. As she worked, she thought about Thomas's offer. Wyoming territory, a fresh start in a place where no one knew her as the widow maker. The prospect was undeniably appealing, but traveling with a man she just met carried its own risks. Thomas had been nothing but respectful and kind, but Eleanor had learned the hard way that men could change once they had a woman in a vulnerable position. Her second husband had seemed gentle until they were married, at which point his possessiveness had revealed itself. Charles had been charming until he had access to her money, then his drinking and gambling had taken over. Yet Thomas felt different. The way he looked at her not with pity or desire or calculation, but with genuine interest and respect, made her want to trust him. And the way her pulse quickened when he was near suggested her heart was already making decisions her mind hadn't settled on. Eleanor finished packing and moved to the window, looking out at the town that had received her with suspicion just a day ago. Thomas had changed that for her, standing beside her when everyone else backed away. Whatever came next, she wouldn't forget that kindness. A movement in the street below caught her eye. Mills and his companions had returned, this time with 2 additional men. They weren't approaching the hotel directly, but had stationed themselves at various points along the street. Mills and the heavyset man outside the general store, the scarred man near the livery stable where Thomas had likely gone, and the newcomers positioned at either end of the main street. They were setting up an ambush. Eleanor's heart raced. Thomas would be walking into a trap when he returned from the stable. She had to warn him somehow. Without thinking further, she grabbed Charles's journal and her reticule and hurried from the room, locking it behind her. If she could reach the back stairs and circle around to the livery without being seen on the main street, she might be able to intercept Thomas before Mills's men did. The hotel's back hallway led to a narrow staircase used by the staff. Eleanor descended quickly, emerging in a small yard behind the building where laundry hung on lines and a stack of firewood waited to be brought inside. A wooden fence separated the yard from an alley that ran parallel to the main street. Eleanor slipped through the gate and into the alley, moving as quickly as she could without running. The livery stable was just a block away. If she could reach it before Thomas finished with the horses, well, look who decided to make this easy for us. The voice froze Eleanor in her tracks. Jasper Mills stepped out from between 2 buildings, blocking her path. His pockmarked face twisted in a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Mrs. Owens, I've been looking for you." Mills approached slowly, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. Eleanor backed away, clutching her reticule tightly. Inside was a small derringer. Charles had given her 2 shots, enough to buy time if nothing else. "Stay away from me, Mills." "Now, is that any way to greet an old friend? Charles and I were close, you know. He told me all about you." Mills continued his advance. "Said you were quite the proper lady in public, but different behind closed doors." Anger flashed through Eleanor, temporarily overriding her fear. Charles was a liar and a drunk, and apparently a would-be bank robber and associate of murderers. Mills's smile faltered. "So you do have his journal. I thought your new friend might be bluffing." He held out his hand. "Give it to me, and maybe I'll let you walk away from this." "I don't believe you." Eleanor continued backing up, trying to keep distance between them. "You killed Charles because he was going to run, and you'll kill me too once you have what you want." "Charles got himself killed," Mills spat. "Couldn't hold his liquor or his tongue. Started bragging about how he was going to use what he knew to start fresh somewhere else." His face darkened with the memory. "Nobody blackmails Jasper Mills. Nobody." Eleanor's back hit a wall she'd run out of alley. Her hand slipped into her reticule, fingers closing around the small derringer. "I don't care about you or your crimes, Mills. I just want to be left alone. Should have thought of that before you took Charles's things." Mills was close now, close enough that Eleanor could smell whiskey on his breath. "The journal. Now." Eleanor pulled the derringer from her reticule and aimed it at Mills's chest. "Back away." Mills laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the narrow alley. "That little pea-shooter. Even if you hit me, it won't stop me from breaking your neck." But he did stop advancing, eyeing the small gun with a mixture of amusement and caution. "It'll make enough noise to bring people running," Eleanor countered, struggling to keep her hand steady. "Including Thomas. Your new protector," Mills sneered. "He's being handled as we speak." My boys are making sure he doesn't interrupt our conversation. Fear for Thomas lanced through Eleanor. If you've hurt him, you'll what? Shoot me with that toy. Mills took another step forward. Face it, Eleanor, you're alone, same as always. No husbands left to hide behind. She's not alone. The voice came from behind Mills, steady and deadly calm. Thomas stood at the entrance to the alley, his revolver trained on Mills's back. Step away from her, Thomas commanded. Slowly. Mills froze, his face contorting with rage. Your timing is inconvenient, Irving. For you, perhaps. Thomas moved forward, his gun never wavering. Your friends at the livery weren't as discreet as they thought, or as skilled. You killed them, Mills asked, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. No, but they'll have headaches when they wake up. Thomas was beside Eleanor now, positioning himself partially in front of her while keeping his gun on Mills. The sheriff is on his way. Seems he's very interested in hearing about the stage robbery near Junction City. Mills's hand twitched toward his own gun, and Eleanor tensed, expecting violence to erupt in the narrow alley. But Mills stilled, apparently thinking better of it. This isn't over, he growled. That journal won't be enough to convict me of anything. Maybe not, Thomas agreed. But it's enough to start an investigation, and investigations have a way of uncovering all sorts of interesting facts. His voice hardened. Now turn around and start walking toward the main street. The sheriff will meet us there. For a tense moment, Eleanor thought Mills would refuse, would draw his gun despite the odds, but self-preservation won out. He turned slowly and began walking as directed, his shoulders rigid with suppressed fury. Are you all right? Thomas asked Eleanor softly as they followed Mills. She nodded, the derringer still clutched in her trembling hand. I thought he might have hurt you. It takes more than 2 clumsy outlaws to get the drop on me. Thomas's eyes never left Mills's back, though I nearly had a heart attack when I returned to the hotel and found you gone. I saw them setting up an ambush. I was trying to warn you. Thomas's expression softened momentarily. That was brave and foolish. I'm learning that the two often go together, Eleanor replied, thinking of his words from the night before. They emerged onto the main street where a small crowd had gathered. The local sheriff, a portly man with a graying mustache, waited with his deputy. The heavyset man who had been with Mills earlier was already in custody, his hands bound behind him. This the one you told me about? The sheriff asked Thomas, eyeing Mills with suspicion. Jasper Mills, Thomas confirmed. Wanted in connection with a stage robbery near Junction City last year, 2 passengers killed. The sheriff's deputy stepped forward with handcuffs. Mills, seeing he was outnumbered, submitted to the arrest with nothing more than a venomous glare at Eleanor and Thomas. I'll need statements from both of you, the sheriff said, and that journal you mentioned. Eleanor handed over Charles's journal, feeling a strange sense of closure as it left her possession. The last tangible connection to her third husband and the troubles he'd brought into her life was passing out of her hands. We'll come to your office right away, Thomas assured the sheriff. But first, I need a moment with Mrs. Owens. The sheriff nodded, directing his deputy to take Mills and the other captured man to the jailhouse. As they walked away, Mills looked back once, his eyes promising retribution. Eleanor shivered despite the warm day. Thomas guided her away from the lingering onlookers, finding a quiet spot on the hotel's front porch. Are you sure you're all right? Mills didn't hurt you. No, I'm fine, just shaken. Eleanor tucked the derringer back into her reticule. Thank you for coming when you did. I should never have left you alone. Thomas's face was tight with self-recrimination. I underestimated Mills's desperation. We both did. Eleanor managed a weak smile. But it's over now. Mills will face justice for what he's done. Thomas nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. The sheriff will hold them until the marshal arrives, which could be a few days. We should stay until then. Our testimony will be needed. The implication hung in the air between them. A few more days together in Whispering Creek before decisions had to be made about what came next. I still want to go to Denver eventually, Eleanor said carefully. My sister is expecting me, of course. Thomas's expression gave nothing away. I can escort you there after this business with Mills is concluded if you'd like. Eleanor studied his face, trying to read his thoughts. And after Denver, what then? That depends on you. Thomas met her gaze directly. My offer stands. Wyoming territory, a fresh start. Together if that's what you want. As traveling companions, Eleanor asked, remembering his earlier clarification. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, hope, perhaps, or a deeper emotion he wasn't ready to name. For now, the rest. We have time to figure out. Eleanor thought about the rumors that had followed her from town to town, the whispers of bad luck and tragedy. She thought about Thomas, who had tied his horse beside hers when everyone else backed away, who had seen beyond her reputation to the woman beneath. I'd like that, she said finally, to see Wyoming with you, to have time to figure out the rest. Thomas's smile transformed his face, erasing the tension of the confrontation with Mills. Then that's what we'll do. As they walked together toward the sheriff's office to give their statements, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of Charles's secrets and Mills's threats was lifting. Ahead lay uncertainty, yes, but also possibility, the chance to rewrite her story with someone who wasn't afraid of her past. The townsfolk of Whispering Creek still watched her with wary eyes as she passed, but their whispers held less power now. Let them talk about bad luck and widows. Eleanor Owens was making her own luck now, with a man brave enough or foolish enough to ride beside her. The next few days passed in a strange limbo. Eleanor and Thomas gave their statements to the sheriff, and a telegram was sent to the marshal's office regarding Mills and his companions. The town buzzed with the news of the arrests and the connection to the stage robbery, and gradually, the focus of the gossip shifted from Eleanor's supposed curse to the excitement of having notorious criminals in their midst. They continued to take their meals together in the hotel dining room, no longer drawing stares of suspicion, but rather curious glances. The story had spread how Thomas had stood by Eleanor when others shunned her, how together they had helped capture wanted men. It wasn't quite acceptance, but it was a far cry from the reception Eleanor had received upon her arrival. In the evenings, they would sit on the hotel's front porch, watching the sunset and talking of their pasts and possible futures. Thomas told her more about his years as a ranger, about the family ranch he'd left behind after his parents died, about his dreams of someday settling down in a place where the mountains met the sky. Eleanor shared stories of her childhood in St. Louis, of her first love and genuine grief for James, of her sister's letters describing life in Denver with her growing family. Have you telegraphed your sister about the change in plans? Thomas asked on the third evening, as they watched lightning flicker on the distant horizon. I sent a wire yesterday, told her I'd be delayed but would still come to visit. Eleanor smoothed her skirt, a nervous gesture. I didn't mention you or Wyoming. Thomas nodded, understanding her caution. Probably wise. She might worry if she knew you were traveling with a man you'd just met. It's not just that. Eleanor turned to face him. I've made poor choices before, rushing into arrangements with men when I was vulnerable. My sister warned me about Charles, but I didn't listen. She sighed. I want to be sure this time, sure of myself and sure of this. Thomas prompted gently. Eleanor gestured between them. Whatever is happening between us, I feel it, Thomas. I think you do too, but I need time to trust it, to trust myself. Thomas took her hand, his touch respectful but warm. I understand, and I'm not asking for promises, Eleanor. Just a chance to see where the road takes us. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. At any point, if you decide Wyoming isn't for you, or I'm not for you, we'll part ways. No questions, no blame. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep in Eleanor's heart. This was different from Charles's empty charm or Michael's possessive affection. Thomas offered companionship without demands, protection without ownership. Thank you, she said softly. They sat in comfortable silence until the distant lightning moved closer and the first drops of rain began to fall, driving them inside for the night. On the morning of the fourth day, the marshal arrived, a tall, weathered man named Davidson who greeted Thomas with the familiarity of old acquaintance. Irving, he said, shaking Thomas's hand in the hotel lobby. Heard you were mixed up in this business with the stage robbers. Might have known you'd be in the thick of it, Thomas smiled. Just happened to be in the right place at the right time, Marshal, or the wrong place, depending on how you look at it. Davidson turned his attention to Eleanor, his expression curious but not unkind. Mrs. Owens. I've taken statements from the sheriff and read your husband's journal. Nasty business. Yes, it was, Eleanor agreed simply. Mills is claiming the journal is a forgery, that your husband never wrote any such thing. Davidson studied her face. But we've got witnesses from Junction City who can place him near the stage robbery, and his partner is talking, hoping for leniency. So you don't need us to testify? Thomas asked. Davidson shook his head. Not immediately. I'll be taking them back to stand trial. If we need you later, we know where to find you. He gave Thomas a knowing look. Wyoming territory, I hear. Thomas didn't deny it. That's the plan. After we visit Mrs. Owens's sister in Denver, the marshal nodded, seemingly satisfied. Well, you two are free to go whenever you're ready. Mills and his gang will be leaving with me on tomorrow morning's train. He tipped his hat to Eleanor. Madam, for what it's worth, I'm sorry about your husband. Sounds like he got mixed up with the wrong crowd. Thank you, Marshal, Eleanor replied, touched by his kindness. Will Mills? Is there any chance he could escape? Come looking for revenge? Davidson's expression hardened. Not a chance. He's facing the gallows for those stage killings. He won't see the outside of a jail again except on his way to the hanging. The blunt words should have been shocking, but Eleanor felt only relief. The threat Mills represented was ending one way or another. After the marshal left, Thomas turned to Eleanor. We could leave tomorrow if you're ready. The horses are rested and we've settled our business here. Eleanor considered the town that had initially received her with suspicion and was now just another stop on her journey. Yes, I'm ready. There's nothing keeping us here now. They spent the day preparing for departure, checking their supplies, purchasing provisions for the trail, making sure their horses were properly shod for the journey ahead. By evening, everything was ready for an early start. At supper, their last in Whispering Creek, the hotel proprietor approached their table with an unexpected courtesy. Mrs. Owens, Mr. Irving, Holly said, his earlier hostility replaced with a somewhat forced affability. I want to apologize for my rudeness when you arrived. Had I known you were assisting the law, you would have treated us with the same basic decency any travelers deserve. Thomas interrupted, his voice pleasant but with that familiar edge of steel. Holly's had the grace to look embarrassed. Yes, well. In any case, your rooms for tonight are complimentary. A token of the town's appreciation for your help with those criminals. Eleanor nodded, accepting the gesture for what it was, not genuine remorse, but the town's way of rewriting the narrative of her visit. No longer the cursed widow, she was now part of an exciting tale of outlaws brought to justice. It was a small victory, but she would take it. After Holly's left, Thomas raised his wine glass. To new beginnings, he said quietly. Eleanor clinked her glass against his. And to making our own luck. They departed at dawn the next morning, the eastern sky painted in shades of pink and gold as they rode out of Whispering Creek. No one watched them leave except the sleepy stable boy, who had overcome enough of his superstition to wish them safe travels. The trail to Denver would take them west and then north, a journey of several days through varied terrain. As they left the town behind, Eleanor felt a sense of lightness, as if she were shedding an old skin with each mile that passed beneath their horses' hooves. Thomas rode beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. They traveled at an easy pace, talking when the mood struck them, comfortable in silence when it didn't. By midday, they had left the familiar landscape around Whispering Creek far behind, entering rolling hills dotted with stands of cottonwood trees. They stopped to rest and water the horses beside a clear stream, spreading a blanket in the dappled shade of a large cottonwood. Thomas produced bread, cheese, and dried fruit from his saddlebags, and they ate their simple meal with the appetite that comes from hours in the saddle. This is nice, Eleanor said, leaning back on her elbows and looking up at the leaves rustling overhead. Being away from towns and people and their judgments, Thomas nodded, stretching out his long legs. One of the reasons I've kept to the trail so long. Out here, a person is judged by their actions, not rumors or superstitions. Is that why you stepped in when you saw me in Whispering Creek? Because you don't believe in judging by rumors. Eleanor had wondered about his initial intervention since the moment it happened. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering, partly, I've never had much patience for mob thinking. He looked at her directly, but mostly it was you. The way you held yourself with dignity despite their whispers, the courage that took. He shrugged, seemingly embarrassed by his admission. I wanted to know the woman who could face that kind of reception without breaking. Heat rose to Eleanor's cheeks. It wasn't courage so much as necessity. You either learn to ignore the whispers or you let them destroy you. That's courage, Eleanor, choosing to continue despite the weight of others' expectations and fears. Thomas reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch light as a feather. It's what drew me to you. The moment hung between them, charged with possibility. Eleanor found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by the warmth in his gray eyes. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her, and her pulse quickened at the prospect. Instead, Thomas stood, offering his hand to help her up. We should keep moving if we want to reach the next water source by nightfall. Eleanor took his hand, trying to hide her disappointment. She reminded herself that this was what she'd asked for, time to know her own mind to be sure. Thomas was respecting her wishes, even if part of her was beginning to wonder if she'd been too cautious. They continued their journey, the landscape gradually changing as they rode. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered on the horizon, and the air held the promise of rain. There's a line shack about 2 miles ahead, Thomas said, eyeing the darkening sky. Used by cattle outfits during roundup, should be empty this time of year. Will we make it before the storm hits? Eleanor asked, noting the increasing wind. If we push the pace a bit, Thomas replied, already urging his horse into a faster trot. Eleanor followed suit, and they rode briskly through the gathering gloom. The first heavy drops began to fall just as a small cabin came into view, nestled against a rocky outcropping that provided some natural shelter from the elements. They reached the line shack as the rain began in earnest, quickly unsaddling the horses and settling them in a lean-to attached to the cabin before hurrying inside with their saddlebags and supplies. The interior was simple but serviceable, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against one wall. A shelf held basic supplies: coffee, beans, salt left for the next occupants. Not exactly the hotel in Whispering Creek, Thomas observed wryly, setting down his gear, but it'll keep us dry. Eleanor looked around, suddenly aware of the intimacy of their situation. They'd been staying in separate rooms at the hotel, propriety maintained despite their growing closeness. Now they faced a night alone together in this small cabin with one bed and nowhere else to go while the storm raged outside. Thomas seemed to read her thoughts. I'll sleep on the floor, he said quickly. You take the bed. Eleanor nodded, grateful for his understanding. I'll see if there's anything to cook with while you start a fire. They settled into domestic tasks with surprising ease, Thomas building a fire in the hearth, while Eleanor found a cast iron pot and some basic provisions to make a simple stew with the supplies they carried. Rain drummed on the roof, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the cabin through its single window, followed by rolling thunder. As they ate their meal at the rough table, Eleanor found herself studying Thomas in the firelight. The flickering flames cast shadows across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the small crinkles at the corners of his eyes when he smiled. She'd been so focused on the threat Mills posed and then on their preparations to leave that she hadn't fully appreciated how handsome he was. You're staring, Thomas observed, his voice gentle. Eleanor didn't look away. I'm wondering something. What's that? Why you haven't tried to kiss me? The words surprised her as much as him, but once spoken, she couldn't take them back. Thomas set down his spoon, his expression serious. Because you asked for time. Because you've had men take advantage of your vulnerability before. Because if I kiss you, I want you to be absolutely certain it's what you want. The honesty of his answer moved her deeply. Here was a man who respected her boundaries even when they were alone, miles from civilization, with no one to know or judge their actions. What if I am certain? Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible above the rain. Thomas's eyes darkened. Are you? Instead of answering, Eleanor rose from her chair and moved around the table to stand before him. Slowly, giving him time to stop her if he wished, she placed her hands on his shoulders and leaned down until their faces were inches apart. I've been cautious all my life, Thomas. Even with James, my first husband, whom I truly loved. Always holding something back, protecting myself." Her fingers moved up to trace the line of his jaw. "I don't want to be cautious with you." Thomas remained still, though she could feel the tension in his shoulders beneath her hands. "Eleanor," he said, her name a question and a warning all at once. She closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was tentative at first, then increasingly confident as his hands came up to frame her face. His mouth was warm and firm against hers, the kiss deepening as she slid onto his lap, her arms encircling his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I first saw you in Whispering Creek," he admitted. Eleanor smiled, feeling a lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with caution or fear. "Even knowing my reputation for bad luck, especially then." Thomas tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've never been luckier than when I tied my horse beside yours." The simple sincerity of his words touched Eleanor deeply. For so long, she'd been defined by tragedy and loss. With Thomas, she was beginning to see herself differently, not as a harbinger of misfortune, but as a woman worthy of happiness and a future unburdened by the past. She kissed him again, reveling in the freedom to express the feelings that had been building since their first meeting. His hands at her waist were strong but gentle, holding her as if she were precious. When the kiss ended, Thomas looked up at her with an expression of wonder. "Are you sure about this, Eleanor? About us?" "I'm sure about this moment," she replied honestly. "The future is still unwritten, but right now I want to be here with you." Thomas nodded, accepting her answer. "That's enough for me. We'll take each day as it comes." The storm continued outside, rain lashing against the cabin walls. But inside, a different kind of storm was brewing, one of awakening feelings and possibilities neither had expected to find on the frontier. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and hopes, exchanging kisses that grew increasingly passionate. True to his word, Thomas slept on the floor near the fire, insisting on maintaining some propriety despite their newfound closeness. Eleanor lay in the narrow bed, listening to his steady breathing and the rain on the roof, feeling more at peace than she had in years. Morning brought clear skies and a sense of renewal. They set out after a simple breakfast, the landscape washed clean by the storm. Eleanor rode beside Thomas, no longer following but keeping pace as an equal. Occasionally their hands would meet as they rode close together, fingers intertwining briefly before separating again, each touch a silent acknowledgement of the connection growing between them. The journey to Denver took 5 more days, days filled with the rhythm of travel and the deepening of their bond. They faced the usual challenges of the trail, a river crossing swollen by the recent rains, a broken horseshoe that needed replacing, a day of scorching heat that forced them to rest in the shade during the hottest hours. Through it all, they worked together with increasing harmony, learning each other's strengths and compensating for weaknesses. At night, they would make camp and sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the companionable silence. Thomas would tell her about the constellations overhead, pointing out patterns his father had taught him as a boy. Eleanor would share recipes passed down from her mother, promising to cook them properly once they had access to more than trail provisions. Their kisses grew more passionate, their embraces more lingering, but Thomas never pressed for more, understanding Eleanor's need to move at her own pace. For her part, Eleanor found herself falling more deeply for this man who had the strength to protect her but never made her feel weak, who desired her but respected her boundaries, who saw beyond her past to the woman she truly was. As they approached Denver, Eleanor felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Her sister, Margaret, had always been protective, and Eleanor wasn't sure how she would react to Thomas. More than that, she wasn't certain how to define what they were to each other more than traveling companions now, but without formal commitments or promises. "You're quiet today," Thomas observed as the outskirts of Denver came into view in the distance, the city sprawling across the plains with the Rocky Mountains rising majestically behind it. "Just thinking about seeing Margaret again. It's been almost 2 years." Eleanor adjusted her hat against the afternoon sun. And about how to introduce you. Thomas's expression was understanding. However you're comfortable, friend, escort, fellow traveler. And what would you prefer? Eleanor asked, watching his face. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The truth, I suppose, that we met under unusual circumstances, that I'm accompanying you to Wyoming afterward, and that I care for you very much. The simple declaration warmed Eleanor from within. I care for you too, Thomas, more than I expected to. Then that's all your sister needs to know for now. The rest we'll figure out along the way. They rode into Denver late that afternoon, the city bustling with activity. It was larger than any place Eleanor had lived since leaving St. Louis, the streets crowded with wagons, riders, and pedestrians. Buildings of brick and stone lined the main thoroughfares, interspersed with wooden structures in various states of construction or repair. The sound of hammering echoed from all directions as the city continued its rapid expansion. Margaret and her husband, Robert, lived in a modest but well-maintained house on the eastern edge of the city. As they approached the address Eleanor had memorized from her sister's letters, she felt a flutter of nerves. She doesn't know about Charles's involvement with Mills, Eleanor said quietly. I never told her the full story of how he died. Thomas nodded. That's your decision to make. You don't owe anyone your pain, Eleanor, not even family. His understanding gave her strength as they dismounted in front of the neat white house with blue shutters. Before Eleanor could even approach the door, it flew open, and a woman who resembled her strongly, the same dark hair and blue eyes, though with a fuller figure and a face unmarked by grief, rushed down the path. Eleanor, oh my goodness, you're finally here. Margaret enveloped her in a tight embrace, then stepped back to look at her. You're too thin, haven't you been eating? Her gaze shifted to Thomas, standing respectfully by the horses. And who is this? Eleanor took a deep breath. Margaret, this is Thomas Irving. Thomas, my sister, Margaret Wilson. Thomas stepped forward, hat in hand. A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Wilson. Your sister has spoken highly of you. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, her protective instincts visibly awakening. Has she indeed? And how exactly do you know my sister, Mr. Irving? Margaret, Eleanor chided gently. Thomas helped me in a difficult situation. He's been escorting me safely to Denver. I see. Margaret's tone suggested she saw more than Eleanor was saying. Well, you're both welcome, of course. Robert will be home soon, and the children are inside, eager to meet their aunt. She turned back toward the house, then paused. We have a spare room for Eleanor, Mr. Irving, but I'm afraid we don't have accommodations for you. I'll find lodgings in town, Thomas assured her. I wouldn't presume upon your hospitality. Margaret nodded, seemingly satisfied with this arrangement. Come inside, both of you. You must be exhausted from your journey. The inside of the house was comfortable and lived in, with sturdy furniture and colorful quilts draped over chairs and settees. Two children, a boy of about 8 and a girl of 6, peeked shyly from the kitchen doorway until Margaret called them forward to meet their aunt. This is James and this is Caroline, Margaret introduced them. Children, this is your Aunt Eleanor, whom you've heard so much about. Eleanor knelt to their level, smiling warmly. Hello, James, Caroline. I'm so happy to finally meet you. Your mother has told me all about you in her letters. The children approached cautiously, studying her with the frank curiosity of youth. Are you really a widow 3 times over? James asked, his eyes wide. James, Margaret scolded. That's not an appropriate question. Eleanor laughed, taking no offense. Yes, I am. But that's not the most interesting thing about me. Would you like to know what is? Both children nodded eagerly. I can whistle like a mockingbird, I can bake the best apple pie west of the Mississippi, and I once outran a thunderstorm on horseback. She winked at them. At least one of those things is true. The children giggled, their initial shyness forgotten. Caroline tugged at Thomas's sleeve. Are you going to marry Aunt Eleanor? She asked with a child's directness. Thomas glanced at Eleanor, his eyes twinkling with amusement. That would be up to your aunt, little one, but I count myself fortunate to know her. Margaret intervened, sending the children to wash up for dinner and showing Eleanor and Thomas where they could freshen up after their journey. Thomas excused himself shortly after, promising to return the next day and heading into town to find lodgings for the duration of their stay. Once he was gone, Margaret cornered Eleanor in the guest room. "All right, out with it. Who is he really, and what's going on between you two?" Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, smiling at her sister's directness. "It's a long story. I have time," Margaret said, settling beside her. So Eleanor told her about riding into Whispering Creek, about the townsfolk's reaction, about Thomas tying his horse beside hers and declaring they'd be lucky together. She explained about Mills and the journal, carefully editing the details of Charles's involvement in the stage robbery to spare her sister's sensibilities. She described their journey to Denver and the growing connection between them. "And now he's taking you to Wyoming." Margaret asked when she finished, "Eleanor, you barely know this man." "I know him better than I knew Michael or Charles when I married them," Eleanor pointed out. "And I'm not marrying Thomas. We're traveling together, seeing where this leads." Margaret sighed, concern evident in her expression. "After everything you've been through, I just don't want to see you hurt again." "Neither does Thomas." Eleanor took her sister's hand. "That's why he's giving me time and space to decide what I want. He's a good man, Margaret, the best I've known since James." "Your first husband," Margaret murmured, remembering, "the only one you truly loved." "Until now," Eleanor said softly. "I think I'm falling in love with Thomas, and it terrifies me and exhilarates me in equal measure." Margaret studied her sister's face, then nodded slowly. "I can see it in your eyes when you talk about him. Just be careful, Eleanor. Guard your heart until you're sure." "I am." Eleanor squeezed her sister's hand. "But I'm also learning that sometimes you have to risk getting hurt to find happiness." Margaret embraced her tightly. "Then I hope he deserves the trust you're placing in him." The days in Denver passed pleasantly. Robert, Margaret's husband, was a kind and jovial man who welcomed Eleanor warmly and treated Thomas with respectful camaraderie. The children quickly became attached to both their aunt and her companion, especially when Thomas showed James how to whittle simple figures from wood and Eleanor taught Caroline to make flower crowns from the wildflowers growing behind the house. Thomas spent his days helping Robert with repairs around the property and his evenings with the family, proving himself both capable and courteous. Margaret gradually warmed to him, her initial suspicion giving way to cautious approval as she observed his treatment of Eleanor attentive, but never possessive, affectionate, but always respectful. One evening, after the children had been put to bed, the four adults sat on the front porch, enjoying the cool night air and the view of the distant mountains silhouetted against the starry sky. "So, Wyoming territory," Robert said, puffing on his pipe. "That's still pretty wild country." "What draws you there, Thomas?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, his shoulder just touching Eleanor's. "Space, opportunity, the chance to build something lasting." He glanced at Eleanor. "I've been thinking about a small ranch, maybe. I grew up on one in Texas, know the work well enough." "Ranching's hard," Robert observed, "especially for a man alone." "I wouldn't be alone," Thomas replied simply, the implication hung in the air. Eleanor felt Margaret's eyes on her but kept her gaze on the darkened landscape. "And you, Eleanor?" Robert asked. "Is ranching in Wyoming what you want?" Eleanor considered the question. "I want peace," she said finally. "A place where I'm not preceded by whispers and rumors, where I can be judged for who I am, not what's happened to me." She turned to Thomas. "If that place is Wyoming with Thomas, then yes, that's what I want." Thomas's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers intertwining. The gesture wasn't lost on Margaret, who exchanged a look with her husband. "Well," Margaret said after a moment, "Wyoming will certainly be different from what you're used to, but perhaps different is exactly what you need." It was as close to a blessing as Eleanor was likely to get from her protective sister, and she accepted it gratefully. As their 2-week stay in Denver drew to a close, Eleanor found herself torn between the comfort of family and the promise of a new beginning with Thomas. Margaret's home offered security and connection to her past, while the journey north represented uncertainty, but also possibility. The evening before their planned departure, Thomas invited Eleanor to walk with him in the garden behind the house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, with the mountains a deepening purple against the horizon. "I've been thinking," Thomas said as they strolled between Margaret's carefully tended flower beds. About Wyoming and what comes next. Eleanor's heart quickened. Oh, Thomas stopped, turning to face her. In the fading light, his expression was earnest and open. I don't want you to come with me out of gratitude, or because you feel you have no other options. Your sister would welcome you here. You could build a life in Denver if that's what you wanted. Is that what you think? That I'm following you because I have nowhere else to go? Eleanor asked, studying his face. I think you've had limited choices for too long. I want you to choose me because you want to, not because it seems like the only path forward. Thomas took her hands in his. If you need more time, if you want to stay here with your sister for a while longer, I understand. I can go ahead, find a place, get it ready, and come back for you. Eleanor was touched by his consideration, but also suddenly certain of what she wanted. Thomas Irving, are you trying to leave me behind? No, he said quickly. Never that. I just want you to be sure. I am sure. Eleanor stepped closer to him. I'm sure that I want to see Wyoming with you. I'm sure that when I'm with you, I feel more myself than I have in years. And I'm sure that I'm falling in love with you. The words, once spoken, hung in the air between them, irrevocable. Eleanor held her breath, waiting for his response. Thomas's face transformed with a joy so pure it made her heart ache. Eleanor, he breathed, pulling her into his arms. I've been in love with you since Whispering Creek. Since the moment you faced down that town's suspicion with your head held high. I just didn't want to pressure you, to make you feel obligated in any way. The only obligation I feel, Eleanor said, her arms sliding around his neck, is to my own heart, and it's telling me that my place is with you. Their kiss was different from those they'd shared before, deeper, more certain, filled with the promise of a future together. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. I should speak to your sister and her husband, he said. Ask for their blessing. Eleanor smiled, touched by his adherence to propriety even now. They already know how I feel about you. But yes, it would mean a lot to Margaret. They returned to the house hand in hand, their decision made. Later that evening, Thomas spoke privately with Robert and Margaret, formally asking for their blessing on his courtship of Eleanor, with the intention of marriage when they were settled in Wyoming. Margaret, though still harboring concerns about the speed of their relationship, gave her cautious approval. If anyone deserves happiness, it's Eleanor, she told Thomas. But if you hurt her, distance won't protect you from me. Thomas accepted the warning with good grace. If I hurt her, I wouldn't deserve protection. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for beginning a journey. They said their goodbyes after breakfast, the children clinging to both Eleanor and Thomas until the last moment. Write to us, Margaret insisted, embracing her sister tightly. Let us know where you settle, and remember you always have a home here if you need it. I know, Eleanor said, blinking back tears. Thank you for everything. As they mounted their horses and rode away, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of sadness and anticipation. She was leaving the only family she had left, but she was riding toward a future she had chosen freely, with a man who saw her for who she truly was. The journey north from Denver into Wyoming territory took them through increasingly rugged terrain across the high plains, through mountain passes, and into valleys sheltered by towering peaks. The landscape was wilder, less settled than what they'd traveled through before, with vast stretches between towns and trading posts. They passed small settlements and ranches, stopping occasionally to rest and resupply. At each place, Thomas would ask questions about land availability, water rights, and grazing conditions, gathering information for when they were ready to settle. Nearly 3 weeks after leaving Denver, they crested a rise and saw before them a valley cradled between mountain ranges, a river winding through its center like a silver ribbon. The grasslands were lush, dotted with stands of aspen and pine, and in the distance, a small settlement of perhaps 24 buildings clustered near where the river bent. Paradise Valley, Thomas said, drawing his horse to a halt beside Eleanor's. That's what the locals call it. The town is Riverton, just established last year. What do you think? Eleanor took in the panoramic view, the beauty of the mountains against the sky, the promise of the fertile valley. It's breathtaking. They say there's still good land available for homesteading near the western edge of the valley, Not too close to town, not too far. Thomas glanced at her. Would you like to take a closer look? Eleanor nodded, a sense of rightness settling over her. Yes, let's go see our future. They rode down into the valley, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grassland. As they approached Riverton, they could see it was indeed a new settlement, many buildings still under construction, others showing the bright lumber of recent completion. A general store, a blacksmith shop, what appeared to be a small hotel, and various houses and businesses lined the single main street. The townspeople looked up with interest as they rode through, nodding greetings but without the suspicion Eleanor had grown accustomed to. Here, everyone was new, everyone was establishing themselves. Her past wouldn't precede her. They secured rooms at the small hotel's separate rooms, maintaining propriety despite their understanding, and spent the evening learning about the town from the hotel proprietor and other locals, who gathered in the modest dining room. Land west of here is good for ranching, confirmed a weathered man who introduced himself as Silas Jenkins. Got water rights sorted, which is more than you can say for some places. I took a parcel about 5 miles out last spring. Neighbors would be welcome. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. We'll ride out tomorrow and have a look, Thomas said. Is there a land office here? Got one just last month, Silas replied. Young fellow named Parker handles the paperwork. If you're serious about settling, best talk to him first thing. The next morning, after meeting with the land agent and obtaining maps of available parcels, Thomas and Eleanor rode west from Riverton. The valley opened before them, the grasslands rippling in the breeze, wildflowers adding splashes of color among the green. About 6 miles from town, they found what they were looking for, a stretch of land bordered by the river on one side and rolling hills on the other, with a natural clearing that would be perfect for a house and outbuildings. A stand of pines provided shelter from the wind, and the grass was thick and rich, ideal for grazing. Thomas dismounted, helping Eleanor down from her horse. They walked the land together, discussing where things might be built, how the property could be developed over time. The connection between them deepened with each shared plan, each vision of what this place could become. This is it, Eleanor said finally, standing on a small rise that overlooked the entire parcel. This feels like home. Thomas took her hand, his expression solemn. Eleanor, before we go any further, there's something I need to ask you. He dropped to one knee, still holding her hand. I know we agreed to see where this journey took us, but I'm certain now of where I want it to lead. I love you, Eleanor Owens. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Eleanor looked down at this man who had changed her life in so many ways, who had stood beside her when others stepped away, who saw strength in her where others saw only tragedy. Yes, she said, her voice steady and sure. Yes, Thomas Irving, I will marry you. Thomas rose, pulling her into his arms and kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally parted, he pressed his forehead to hers. I promise you won't regret it, he whispered. I know, Eleanor replied, her heart fuller than she'd ever thought possible. They returned to Riverton to file a claim on the land and to find the local preacher. There was no reason to wait, they agreed. They had already faced challenges together and emerged stronger. They knew each other's pasts and accepted them. Most importantly, they shared a vision for the future, a home built with their own hands, a life crafted from their shared dreams. 3 days later, with Silas Jenkins and his wife as witnesses, Eleanor Owens became Eleanor Irving in a simple ceremony at Riverton's newly constructed church. She wore her best dress, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Thomas had somehow procured a new shirt and waistcoat for the occasion and had even cut his hair. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher declared, beaming at the couple. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. As Thomas kissed her, Eleanor felt the last shadows of her past receding. The whispers were gone, the suspicions left behind in the towns they'd traveled through. Here, in this new place, they were simply Mr. and Mrs. Irving, settlers building a future in Wyoming territory. Their first weeks as a married couple were spent in a tent on their land while they worked on constructing a small cabin. It was hard work, but they tackled it together, Thomas handling the heavy lifting and construction while Eleanor planned the layout and interior. Silas and other neighbors helped with the raising of the walls and roof, the frontier tradition of community assistance in full evidence. By the time the first snow fell, they had a snug cabin with a stone fireplace, sturdy furniture Thomas had crafted himself, and curtains Eleanor had sewn from fabric purchased in Riverton. It wasn't large or fancy, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and filled with their growing love. Winter in Wyoming was harsh but beautiful. Snow blanketed their land, transforming it into a glistening wonderland. Inside their cabin, Eleanor and Thomas created their own warmth, learning the rhythms of married life, planning for spring planting, and dreaming of the ranch they would build together. They became known in Riverton as a couple who faced life's challenges side by side. When Thomas brought supplies from town, people would ask after Mrs. Irving with genuine warmth. When Eleanor accompanied him, she was greeted with respect and friendship. No one whispered about bad luck or curses. No one knew her as the widow maker. Here, she was simply Eleanor Irving, a capable woman building a life with her husband. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers and new growth. They expanded their cabin, adding a second room and a covered porch. Thomas acquired their first cattle, a small herd to start, with plans to expand as they established themselves. Eleanor planted a vegetable garden and began keeping chickens, making their homestead increasingly self-sufficient. In late summer, as they celebrated their first anniversary, Eleanor shared news that brought tears of joy to Thomas's eyes. They were expecting a child in the early spring. "Are you happy?" she asked as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and purple. Thomas pulled her close, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he replied. "Are you afraid at all, after everything?" Eleanor understood his concern. Her past losses cast a long shadow, even here in their new beginning. "A little," she admitted, "but mostly I'm hopeful. This feels right, Thomas, all of it. You are home, this baby. Like this is where I was always meant to be." "I knew it the moment I saw you in Whispering Creek," Thomas said, kissing her temple. "Something told me to tie my horse beside yours." "Best decision I ever made." Eleanor smiled, remembering the whispers, the stares, and Thomas's defiant declaration. "Then we'll be lucky together," he'd said, and how right he had been. Together, they had created their own luck, their own destiny, far from the shadows of the past. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor leaned her head on her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single act of kindness, and that love can indeed bloom in the most unexpected places, even in the wild heart of Wyoming territory, where a former widow and a former Texas Ranger had found home in each other's arms. 5 years later, the Irving Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous in Paradise Valley. The original cabin had been expanded into a comfortable 2-story house with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Outbuildings dotted the property: a barn, a bunkhouse for the 2 hired hands who helped with the cattle, a smokehouse, and a chicken coop. Their herd now numbered over 200 head, and Thomas's careful breeding program was producing stock known throughout the territory for its quality. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching as Thomas played with their children in the yard: 4-year-old James, named for Eleanor's first husband in a gesture that acknowledged rather than erased the past, and 2-year-old Margaret, named for Eleanor's sister. A third child was on the way, though only Thomas knew this yet. Eleanor had discovered it just the day before and was waiting for a quiet moment to share the news. As she watched her family, Eleanor reflected on how far they had come from that day in Whispering Creek. The town that had once shunned her was now just a distant memory, a story they sometimes told friends about how they met. No one in Riverton, now a thriving settlement of over 100 buildings with a school, a proper church, and even a small newspaper, knew Eleanor as anything other than Thomas Irving's capable, kind-hearted wife. They had received word from Margaret just last month that she, Robert, and the children would be visiting in the summer, making the journey west to see the life Eleanor and Thomas had built. The letter had expressed both excitement about the reunion and a touch of sisterly smugness that Eleanor's impulsive decision to follow Thomas to Wyoming had turned out so well. Thomas looked up from his play with the children, catching Eleanor's eye across the yard. Even after 5 years of marriage, that look still sent a flutter through her heart. He smiled, the same smile that had given her hope when the rest of the world seemed determined to remind her of tragedy, and waved her over to join their game. As Eleanor stepped off the porch and crossed the yard to her family, she thought about the bad luck that had dogged her steps for so long, and the good luck she and Thomas had created together. Perhaps there was no such thing as luck at all, she reflected, only choices and consequences, courage and fear, love and its absence. Thomas caught her around the waist as she reached them, pulling her into their circle of play. James wrapped his arms around her legs, and little Margaret reached up with chubby hands, demanding to be lifted. Surrounded by their warmth and laughter, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that the townsfolk of Whispering Creek had been wrong. She wasn't bad luck. She was simply a woman who had endured loss and found the strength to love again. And in Thomas Irving, she had found a man brave enough or perhaps foolish enough to believe that together, they could make their own luck. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting their valley in the golden light of approaching evening, Eleanor looked at her husband over their children's heads and smiled. "I love you," she mouthed silently. "And I love you," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she adored. Lucky me. Lucky us, Eleanor thought, as their children's laughter echoed across the homestead they had built together. Lucky us indeed.